And remember, if you do start, there's no shortcuts. This is like anything in life. There will not be a shortcut. There does not exist a course that will teach you how to. Thank you. Hey guys, how's it going? How was lunch? All right, so I'm super excited to be talking to you today. I'll probably be looking a little up there because the screen is not on, but I'll be talking to you about something I care personally a lot about because I lived this story. I learned to code products in less than a year, and just to get a sense of people in the room, who here currently knows how to code? Just raise your hand. Maybe like 30, 40%, that's pretty great. Hopefully, I'd say in the next 5 years, everyone will have their hand up. But I want to, before jumping into this, explain why I'm giving this talk. I hope that at the end of this talk, everyone in this room, whether you know how to code or whether you don't, are a little inspired to either learn or understand how others may be learning and why they should learn, or the perspectives or things that might be preventing them from actually being able to learn. And so, before I jump into, this isn't working. I'll just grab the other one. There we go. Before I jump into really the bulk of the talk, I want to share my story a little bit. And so, Flashback 2011, 2015, I was a science nerd. I was doing a degree in chemical engineering. I basically knew right away that I didn't want to work in an oil rig. I had a lot of fun in my degree, but I pivoted. I went into management consulting. I lived the corporate dream, which I think probably a couple in this room have done. I commuted my life away. It was a very strange time because I was basically like working my way up to a career that many people aspired to have. I, at one point, aspired to have. But I knew pretty much right away that was not the life I wanted to live. So I actually spent most of that year acquiring any skill that I thought would translate to remote work. So that included basically any digital skills, social media, SEO. At one point, I actually had 4 gigs on the side of my full-time consulting role, which was a lot, but luckily, it did land me a full-time remote role. So I spent 3 years at a company called TopTal. I mostly did marketing with them, so I started on the growth team and then pivoted to lead the publications team. So I learned a lot, and I still love marketing. I actually still work in marketing full-time. But what was cool about that particular experience was that TopTal was a tech company, and it was really my first chance at exposure to tech, and I fell in love with it. I got to work with developers. I got to see what people were creating, because TopTal has thousands of clients every year that are creating software products themselves. I got to go to conferences in tech. It was really, really cool, but I kind of recognized that if I was just going to kind of be on the outskirts of tech doing marketing, I couldn't really contribute. If I didn't know how to code, I couldn't really understand what was going on around me. And so midway through that experience, I decided this was a big barrier for me. Whether or not I wanted to be a full-time developer, I wanted to be able to understand and actually create things in this world. And so what I did was in 2018, as I was working in TopTal, I decided to basically say, this is my year of learning, and it would specifically be dedicated to learning to code. And I did exactly that. I started in February of 2018, and by the end of that year, I had launched 4 products that I coded myself. I developed a passion for supporting women in tech because I recognized that a lot of us don't necessarily see ourselves in that environment. I also started a personal blog, which has now been read by hundreds of thousands, which focuses on things like remote work and learning to code. And it was a crazy year for me. 2018 by far has been the craziest year for me, but it was because I decided to learn to code in that year. Now, as you can see, I'm still working in marketing. I still love it, but I can definitively say that me learning that skill set was incredibly impactful in my full-time role and outside of it. And I guess if you're going to take anything away from my personal story before we get into some of the details, is that I didn't have a very stereotypical path into technology, and I don't think you need to. I also don't work full-time as a developer, and I don't think you need to do that to learn to code. I think a lot of people think of things in terms of dichotomies, so people think, if I don't want to be a full-time developer, like, why bother? Why bother learning to code if I'm not going to use that as my full-time income? I think it's actually not the way we should look at things. Nothing needs to be that simple. We live dynamic lives, and you can be a developer, you can be a marketer, you can be a writer, you can be many things in life, and hopefully at the end of this talk, you will feel inspired to also add development to your skill set. So, flashback to February 2018, again, that's when I started. I want to emphasize that I basically started from zero. I had no idea what I was doing. I'd never taken a technical course before. And so, if you even work on WordPress sites, if you have coded Excel macros, if you even know what a div is, you're actually further ahead than where I was in February 2018. And by November, I had, again, coded, launched, and created all 4 of these projects. And so quickly going to go over them. Nomad Hub was the first project that I wanted to create. It really was kind of like the motivating force behind me continuing to learn and get through the roadblocks. Make Yourself Great Again was a calculator for visualizing wasted time, which I'll talk about in a bit, but that went to #1 on Product Hunt, and it was coded in 25 days. The third project was done in a 24-hour startup challenge. So you can see as I went through them, I got much quicker at coding, because once you know the fundamentals, you can create things much more effectively. And the fourth one was Make. I wanted to understand basically the gender equation on Product Hunt. So I did that, and that ended up winning an award. And obviously this is basically a humble brag for me to be like, look what I did in 2018, but it's also to show that in February I knew nothing, and by November I had coded these things and done pretty well. And so you can too. Let's talk tech overall. Like, why does it matter? If you're in this room and you don't know how to code, why should you care? Why should you actually bother investing some amount of time to learn this stuff? So this is an opinion, but I do fundamentally believe that tech is going to be, if it isn't already, the most influential industry on our future. It'll impact things like diversity. It'll impact how we distribute wealth. And if you basically don't know how to code or don't understand technology, you are putting a barrier between yourself and that future, whether it means contributing to that future or at least understanding what's going on in that future. And in addition to that, as we create that future, if you know how to code, you are able to contribute and actually be a part of that decision-making process through your contribution. So even if you don't want to be a full-time developer, if you understand technology, you are no longer putting that barrier between yourself and those future decisions. And so, throughout this talk, I'll be giving a little bit of a history of development, or a couple things that I think a lot of people in this room are not aware of in terms of how certain events actually impact the way we see developers, the way that we perceive someone who might be a developer. Also the psychology of learning, and certain roadblocks that I think prevent people from learning to code, and certainly prevented me for a while. And then finally some practical tips, but there aren't actually that many practical tips in this talk, and that's for a reason. I cannot teach you to code in an hour, no one can, but hopefully at the end of this talk you'll have a better understanding of what may be stopping you now, and hopefully feel very confident about moving forward into this digital world. So I'm going to start with a story, and the story goes like this. There's a terrible car accident in which the father is killed and his son is injured and taken to the hospital. When the boy is brought into surgery, the surgeon looks at the boy and says, "I cannot operate on this patient. This is my son." So take a second to think about how this is possible. And some of you may have gotten the answer right away. I heard this on the radio a couple years ago, and I did not get the answer right away until they said the answer. And of course the answer is that the surgeon is the mother. And I share this because I candidly think of myself as a very open-minded person, but I didn't get the answer. It doesn't mean I'm a bad person. It doesn't mean you're a bad person if you didn't get the answer to this. It's because of something very simple, which is perception bias. Perception bias is basically your ability to see things based on your particular frame of reference. It's very normal. It's just a fancy way of saying with everything we do, there's some sort of filter or many filters. And these filters influence the way we think, who we hire, how we negotiate, whether we feel comfortable negotiating. And I bring this up because I think if you haven't chosen to learn to code, in certain circumstances, it's because you've actually labeled yourself or even coded yourself as someone who is, quote unquote, not a developer. And with this knowledge of perception bias, if you take a look at the 3 images on the right, take a second to guess who you think might be the developer among those 3 people. And of course, as I think many people in this room will hopefully have guessed, it's all 3 of them. So these are 3 people that I actually have come into contact with on a personal level in some way. So Martha on the left-hand side, she actually won the Africa edition of the Top Tall Women's Scholarship. She actually learned to code on paper before getting access to a computer. And now she is using her skills to create a machine learning app to help other women in Ghana also learn to code. Ethan, in the middle, he actually won the 24-hour startup challenge that I participated in 2018, and he's 15 years old, someone you probably wouldn't label if you were on a street and say, hey, that guy's probably a developer, but he definitely is also a developer. And this is Xiaoling, which is actually my mom. She's an immigrant from Taiwan. She's been a QA engineer for over 2 decades, and she also is a developer. So again, 3 people you wouldn't necessarily pick out and say, hey, those people look like developers, but they definitely are. And so I wanted to, again, share a little bit of history. And of course, this is just one data point in a very complex history that spanned multiple decades. But it's something that, interestingly enough, many people are not aware of. So if we take development back to the 40s and 50s, this is actually a time period when many women were involved in that involvement of technology and of programming. And interestingly enough, in 1966, there was something called the Canon-Peary test. And the Canon-Peary test was basically a test as development or as engineering roles were becoming more competitive. Technical recruiters wanted to know what makes a really good developer. How do we pick out the best developer amongst a group of people? And so the test took a look at a select group of people, and the results basically showed 2 things. Really great developers are, 1, good problem solvers, which I think makes sense. Good problem solvers thrive everywhere. But the second aspect of good developers was apparently good developers don't like people. And so that actually was taken by technical recruiters as something to source for and to look for. And they actually tried to identify or hire developers based on that trait. And again, I want to be clear that this is not like a definitive point in history, but it is something to take account of. In that technical recruiters were actually looking for individuals who possessed this quality. Those people were getting hired, and those people basically probably got into hiring positions and then hired people just like them. And so I'm sharing this because this is, again, one of many points in history where we can look back and say, hey, that's kind of strange, but we can also use it as something to maybe understand how we perceive developers today and how that may be inaccurate. And so, tied to this, I think I say there's 7 myths of learning to code. There are probably many more, but I'm going to share 7 that I think are really important for people who, again, if you don't know how to code, these may be preventing you from learning, and if you do know how, maybe have a think about how these may be influencing the way that you're engaging with people who aren't quote-unquote technical. So the first one is that there are 2 types of people who can code, people who can't code. There's almost like an impermeable membrane between these 2 types of people, and you are in one of those boxes. And it sounds ridiculous when it's called out exactly like that, but in reality, just like any other skill set, it's a learning curve. And depending on where you are on that learning curve is just a function of how much time you've spent on that particular skill. So yes, if you've never coded before, you're at the bottom of that learning curve. But the person at the top of that learning curve is only there because they've spent 10 years learning to code. And I think it's very strange because people really do tend to put themselves in one of those boxes with development, but you would never compare yourself to a native Spanish speaker if you were just starting to learn Spanish. So I think it's really important to kind of just, when you're learning to code or if you're considering it, visualize yourself along this curve. And also know that people who are at the top of that curve with development specifically are spending a lot of their day on sites like Stack Overflow or Googling things, trying to find solutions. There's no point where that curve actually stops. Myth number 2, which I think this is probably the one that actually stops people the most once they've actually convinced themselves, I'm going to learn to code, and then once they actually go to do it, they get overwhelmed by choosing a stack. So if you're not familiar with Stack, I think many people in this room will be, but when you code an application or a website, there's going to be certain technologies or frameworks or tools that go into actually building that site. And so when many people start to consider learning to code, they're like, oh, should I do JavaScript or Ruby or Python? Like, which one should I do? Which one's the most optimal? If I don't choose the right one right now, that's going to influence my entire future in development. And in reality, Stack really, truly does not matter. And you just need to select one and start executing. And these are 3 examples of companies that we all know very well, Facebook, Spotify, and Medium. And you can just get a sense of exactly why Stack doesn't matter, because all 3 of these companies have completely different stacks. You don't need to know what the technologies on here even mean, but you can clearly see Facebook uses React and PHP, Spotify uses Python and Java, Medium uses Node and Go. And so all 3 of these companies have been extremely successful with completely different stacks. And so if you are considering learning to code, please do not get hung up on Stack. It truly does not matter. Myth number 3 is tied to number 2, and it's tied to this concept of getting overwhelmed by choosing something optimal. And I think technology is so exciting because so much is happening so quickly, and you always hear of a new JavaScript framework popping up, and you're like, oh, I'm so far behind because there's all these things happening, and everyone already knows more than me. And it is exciting because there's so much going on, but I think it's also overwhelming because you're like, what should I learn? And there's just so much out there. And so I saw this on Quora, and it's basically like an overview of web development. So you've got front end and back end and all of the different technologies, how they branch off, how they relate to each other. And this is really overwhelming. And there is probably no developer that knows everything on this slide. But if you're new to it, you feel like people do, and you feel like you're behind. And my reality within this is, there we go. My reality is that. So all of the projects that I mentioned earlier were all coded with this. So on the front end, just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. The back end, I use Node as my back end and Mongo as my database, and that's what I created everything with. And so instead of getting overwhelmed by, let's see if it goes back, that's what I learned. You don't need to know what I know, but something like that. And tied to that, people, you read blog posts where you're like, oh, should I learn Angular versus Vue versus React? It doesn't matter. Don't even touch the frameworks if you're first starting. You always hear people kind of hating on PHP. Most of the websites in the world are made with PHP. WordPress, Facebook. If you are a Nomad, you probably are familiar with Peter Levels. All of his sites, including Nomad List, are created in PHP. He just got to 1 million ARR recently, and that was created with PHP. So don't spend time hating on any particular frameworks and just get started. And I think the image on the right-hand side is pretty funny. It's this concept that there's this like road to success, and you can get very, very distracted if you start touching the frameworks and getting excited about the most exciting new framework that came out. Just focus on what you know and actually creating things. And so if you are new to development, this is really this is what you need to know to start creating things. You only need to know HTML and CSS if you want to create a static site, like portfolio or a site that has your work on it. If you want to start adding toggling or animation or just simple dynamic changes on your site, you only need to know JavaScript. And if you need to start tying into a backend, yes, you need to learn a backend language, but you only need to know one. So if you're thinking about Node or Python or Ruby or C#, it doesn't matter. You just need to know one. And so again, at the bottom is a reminder of my particular stack. You don't need to learn that stack, but that's an overview of the type of thing that you might need to learn. Myth number 4, here a lot of people say things like, I just don't get programming, again, like putting themselves into a box of like, this isn't for me, or I'll never get this. You hear that a lot with people when they're younger and they say that about math. I think with programming it's really interesting because people tend to, when they first start and they run into roadblocks, think that they don't understand how programming works. So realistically what I'm talking about is they don't understand the logic or the reasoning conducted. In reality, most of the time people can understand the logic and they run into roadblocks with syntax because syntax is just a set of rules so that a computer can understand the code. And so if there's one semicolon in the wrong spot or they're just not coding exactly how a computer can render it, it won't understand. And that's when they get frustrated and they feel like they can't actually code. But if you show people simple code, like the image on the screen, most people can understand what that actually means. And in this particular case, it's just a pop-up that shows a quote, and then it disappears after 4.2 seconds. And most people, if I showed you that, would be able to say, yeah, I totally know what that means. I could totally understand the logic behind it. But if you're just starting to code, sure, you might not be able to actually code that with the particular syntax. But it's just like learning any other language. When you're learning Spanish or German, you learn does a verb come before noun? These are all very simple things, but when you're learning spoken languages or other skills, there's room to be slightly wrong. And with code, unfortunately, it's binary, and that's when people start to get tripped up because they're not doing something exactly right and they think they don't understand the logic. But in reality, it's the syntax. And so the great thing about coding is that you do actually have this constant dictionary available to you. And so I think it's really important to decipher between those two things. Myth number 5. A lot of people say I don't have anything to build. If you don't want to build something, that's great too. But I find a lot of people who are inching, I want to build my own company, I want to get started, but I just don't know what to build. And I think the issue often is that people are looking for an idea that's too perfect. They're looking for the next unicorn. They're looking to create this like amazing thing that no one's ever heard of. But in reality, most companies that you are familiar with are very, very simple and very tied to concepts that you've heard of before. So Evernote, over 200 million users, that's effectively a glorified note-taking app. Reddit, number 3 site in the US, that's a public forum. And Medium is over 60 million monthly users, and I think that number is actually old. It's a blogging platform. And so before you go and like dig deep and try to find this like revolutionary idea to build, just remember that most things don't need to be revolutionary, and in fact, ideas are worth almost nothing, and execution is everything. So this is an idea that I think was originally shared by Derek Sivers, but it's this concept that success is a function of ideas and execution, and in that function, ideas are worth almost nothing. So just as an example, if you took, for example, an amazing idea multiplied by average execution, you're at $200,000. If you take an average idea multiplied by amazing execution, you're at $50 million. These are obviously arbitrary numbers, but it shows that realistically in life, like everyone has the same ideas. None of us are that special. What actually makes you special is when you execute. Myth number 6, this one is my favorite because it's something that I felt for a very long time, and it's this concept of starting too late, where a lot of people feel like, there's already so many developers in the world, so many people with computer science degrees, I'm basically like behind the curve and I'll never catch up, so like why bother learning? I think it's really interesting because that exists, or that makes sense if you're talking about fads. So for example, fidget spinners, like everyone loved fidget spinners, everyone cared, and then one day they didn't, right? And sorry, like if you had a fidget spinner company, like sorry, no one cares anymore. But if you are talking about learning to code, technology is again becoming more and more influential in our daily lives, and there's really no sign of that not becoming true. So you have an opportunity to get in to this industry even if you haven't already. And the way I like to imagine it is, imagine there's like this tech bus. This tech bus it comes every day at 9 a.m. It's come every day for the last couple decades. Some people got on it like 30 years ago. Some people got on it yesterday. If you're not on it already, like just get on tomorrow or in a week or whenever you feel comfortable doing it, but you're not too late. And actually, when you relate it to how many people in the world really know how to code, only around 0.3 to 0.5% of people currently know how to code. And if you look at, or if you imagine the diffusion of innovation curve, really with anything, there's innovators, there's early adopters, and then there's the early majority. And with anything, you want to get in before that critical mass. And if you think 0.3 to 0.5%, that's early in the innovator stage. And so if you start today or tomorrow or in 2 weeks, like you're still very much an innovator. And so I would really, really emphasize that starting too late, I don't think it holds true, at least at this point in time. And finally, I don't have enough time. This is absolutely an opinion, but I think everyone in this room has enough time to start learning to code if that is a priority for you. You can actually learn to code in a matter of weeks or months, and I'll get into that in a second. But what I would encourage you to do is assess your time. It sounds like very simple, but I like to call it this like digital look in the mirror. You can do it at begreat.me, which is one of the sites I built, but you can also just do it on paper. But take accountability of basically what I would call distractions and opportunities or investments. And it's very simple, like distractions are anything that if you do them over time, they will compound to either be neutral or affect you negatively. So these are things like anything that reduces your attention span over time or inhibits your ability to form long-term relationships, versus investments or opportunities, if you do them over time, they benefit you very significantly over time. And so take account of what those things are in your life, and I've done this exercise with many people, and they're very surprised, even though we think we're not so bad with our time, they're surprised at how much is falling into that distraction stage. I'd say like 90% of people who have done this have more distractions in their life than investments. And if you just take some part of that distraction time and reallocate it, you'll be very surprised at how much you can fit in, like learning to code. So those are the 7 myths. Again, I think they're these like limiting beliefs that stop people from getting started. And so again, I hope you leave this talk and think, maybe she's right. Like maybe anyone can actually learn to code. Maybe stack doesn't matter, and maybe like I really only need to know a bit of the development puzzle that's been overwhelming me. Maybe I actually am not so bad at logic, and I'll learn syntax over time, and maybe I should stop looking for super difficult ideas and actually just get started and use my time more effectively. But really the best way to put development in a space that you think is accessible is to just start. Like any skill, like stop pushing it off, but just like sit down one day with a code editor or with a new course and just try it before you write it off. And so remember me, that is me before my year of learning to code. And I wanted to share a little bit about my story, what I did. And so I think the fundamental thing that I did that year was I made it my #1 priority, but I also tracked it. I think we're very quick to add KPIs into our professional lives, but for whatever reason we think it's like too obsessive compulsive or whatever to track your personal life in a way that's actually quantifiable. I felt that way for a long time, but this year that particular year, I changed that, and I actually started tracking coding in addition to other things in my personal life. And it's very simple. It's just a Google sheet that said, when am I learning to code, when am I not, when am I learning? And you can see there was points in time where I was like absolutely killing it and learning multiple sections a day, and there was points where I was definitely not accountable, and I would tell myself to get my shit together, and then again, get my shit together. And the point here is that I was definitely not perfect during that year, and if you decide to learn to code, you also don't need to be perfect throughout that time period. But if you stick to it and track yourself and hold yourself accountable to some degree, you'll get there. And so one of the outputs that I wasn't expecting in my journey of tracking it is that now I can actually look back and say, of the 300 or so days that I spent, from February to November, after I'd launched those 4 projects, I had spent 116 of those days on coding. And probably on average across those days, I spent 2 to 3 hours on average. Some days I spent 15 minutes, some days I spent 6 to 8 hours if I was really concentrating on a project. But now I have a number that I can tie to, and that number I approximate to be 300 hours. And I think it's a cool thing to know that I think I spent 300 hours learning to code, and I think that's actually like a number that other people can at least start to get a sense of if it's something that they're debating integrating into their lives. And so if we take this number of approximately 300 hours, you start to get a sense of like, how long would this really take? And if you do spend 1 hour a week, which realistically, like among our weeks, is not that much, it really does take a long time. It takes 6 years to learn to code. But as you start to scale that up to, let's say, 3 hours a week, or really 1 hour every other day, you're already reducing that to around 2 years. If you dedicate an hour a day to learning to code, you will be able to code and launch apps within a year, I guarantee it. And that's essentially what I did. Around 300 hours, I did it in just under a year. That was my timeline, around an hour a day. And if you start to really have more time in your life and you can do a part-time or full-time commitment, you're looking at a couple months, which a lot of people, if you don't know how to code, would be like, no, that's crazy. Like, people go and do computer science degrees for 4 years. Like, there's no way you could learn to code in 2 months. Coding, just like any other skill, is a function of the time you put in. If you put in a full-time commitment over 2 months, I guarantee you will be able to create apps by the end of that timeline. So if you are starting out and you want to learn to code, one thing that I would advise is that you should find your why. And I know that sounds like super like personal development-y, not actionable, but it's super important because you need to understand like what's actually going to motivate you through you learning. And so do you want to become a paid developer? Do you want to be able to create your own products? Do you want to up-level your skills so you can hire developers, or you're a product manager and you want to more effectively work with developers? Whatever it is, it's cool, but you should know that because it influences the skills that you actually spend your time learning. But again, it also motivates you through the inevitable roadblocks. And it ties to this, the idea of learning to code is not easy, and I want to go over this learning cycle because I think it ties into that concept of like knowing your why and pushing through some of the roadblocks. So this learning cycle starts in the upper left with unconscious incompetence, and it's this concept that basically it's a state where you don't know that you don't know something, or you don't know that you're bad at something. There is some section of our lives where that is true always. But once you acknowledge that you don't know something, then you move to the upper right. So you move to that green box, which is conscious incompetence. You basically then are aware that you don't know something. As you start to work your way to learning that thing, you move down into conscious competence, which basically means you can now do the thing, but it takes a lot of brain power. You're learning to do the thing. And then after, I think, a lot of time, and I think it's very rare to be in that bottom left, you're in unconscious competence, which basically means like you're so good at something that you don't really need to think about it as you're doing it. But what I think is interesting is like the least comfortable position across these 4 areas is the upper right. It's the space where you basically are like, like I know I'm pretty bad at something. And it's not a comfortable place to be, but that's where you learn, that's where you grow, and that's actually something that I think the smartest and most successful people in life learn to like bask in that upper right, versus the other areas where you're okay with not knowing something, or you're happy to be okay at something. And so this quote from the book Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, I think encapsulates what I'm trying to say here, and the quote goes like this. The rare people who do become truly exceptional at something do so not because they're exceptional, not because they believe they're exceptional. On the contrary, they become amazing because they're obsessed with improvement. And that obsession with improvement stems from the belief that they are, in fact, not that great at all. It's anti-entitlement. People who become great at something become great because they understand that they're not already great, that they're mediocre, they're average, and that they could do so much better. So again, in life, I think it's like really kind of soothing to realize like we're all like pretty bad at certain things, and it's pretty empowering to realize that and bask in that upper right section. So next steps, if you do want to learn, one other piece of advice I would say is create a project at each juncture. It's kind of the equivalent of if you're learning a spoken language and you like move to that country to actually fully understand it and immerse yourself in it. I think that's a similar equivalent or parallel when you're learning to code. So some examples, if you're learning HTML and CSS, build a personal page just saying like, hey, I'm online, but build it yourself. If you're learning some JavaScript, create a to-do list. That might sound far away for someone who doesn't know how to code, but if you get started, that's really within a couple weeks for sure. And remember, Evernote is just a glorified to-do list. Comprehensive, if you start to learn more comprehensive JavaScript, then create a fun project like a color randomizer. Doesn't matter, but create something. And then if you start to integrate with the back end, like create a directory, but just make sure you're actually creating something so it feels tangible. And remember, if you do start, there's no shortcuts. This is like anything in life, there will not be a shortcut. There does not exist a course that will teach you how to code in 1/10 of the time of other courses. You need to put in the time and the effort, but you will get there. If you do it, there will be ups and downs. I always say, again, coding is binary, so there's times where you want to pull your hair out. There was one time where I spent 4 hours trying to fix something. I ended up going to bed, turned my computer on in the morning, restarted my app, and it worked because I just needed to restart my database. But it happens, and I think with code, again, it happens more than other skills, but it's okay. And imposter syndrome, I think it's especially real with development. Don't compare yourself to people who have been doing this for 10 years. It just doesn't make any sense. Find your habit loop is also important, and so if you've ever heard of the books Power of Habit or Atomic Habits, they both talk about this. There's basically a habit loop which influences a lot of things, a lot more things than you would expect in our lives. And there's normally a cue, a routine, and a reward. So a cue, actually, it's that reminder of why you want to do something. So you do it. That's a routine. And then there's, hopefully, if you want to actually close this habit loop, there needs to be a reward. And that's, again, why I say create a project or create something that's tangible. Because if not, I see a lot of people just taking Udemy courses or learning on their own without actually closing that habit loop. There's no reward, and they've spent 5 months, and they feel like they haven't gotten anywhere. And so make sure, as you're learning anything, but especially learning to code, you find a reward at some part of that cycle. And be a developer. I wrote an article about this. It's like, when do you become a developer? Is it when you write your first line of code? Is it when you get hired? Is it when you get your first user on your application? No one knows. I tweeted it, and literally no one knew. It was completely distributed. And so if you are learning to code, don't get hung up on that. Just be a developer. Call yourself a developer. Join communities, and don't be afraid to be there. Follow people on social. Listen to the right podcasts and tech talk. But be a developer. Don't be afraid, or don't kind of isolate yourself from that. And if you're going to take anything from this talk, it's this slide. I think it kind of ties in a lot of the things that I've mentioned throughout this talk, but it's really this idea of continuous improvement, which applies to development, but it also applies to basically anything in life. And so if you look at the upper right, it's math, but it's the idea of continuous improvement. If you improve 1% every day for a year, you get to 38. And if you move in the wrong direction by 1% every day for a year, you get at 3%. And so it's incredibly impactful when you register that into your life, because I think a lot of us prevent ourselves from doing things because we imagine everything as these big blocks or these big barriers, but really just start doing something a little bit every day and you'll get there. And so set your personal KPIs, track your success. It might sound crazy to you, but I think it's extremely influential in actually getting anywhere in life. And then remember, this is also from The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, this concept of fuck bucks. Get comfortable with the fact that you have a finite amount of time in your life, all of us do, so make sure you're spending it on things that you think are influential, and also consider what are the types of things that I can learn now that will influence or benefit me for many, many years to come, like development, like learning another spoken language, like investing in a relationship. Like, what am I actually spending my time on today that will positively impact me in the future? And again, remember, overnight success does not exist, despite what TechCrunch will tell you. So focus on execution. Ideas are worth almost nothing. And so the final slide is just have fun with it. If you do learn to code or really do anything, remember that times will be tough, especially if you're learning, but don't forget to have fun with it, because that's when you'll quit and be like, why did I just spend 3 months learning something and just bang my head against the wall. And so I like this tweet from Elizabeth. I don't know her, but she says, decided to write some code to make a very basic prototype of an idea I'm toying around with, and oh my god, this is ridiculously fun. Not sure if anyone else knew coding was cool, so I thought I'd share it as a PSA. And I feel like that, when I finally really started to get my bearings with coding, I was like, oh my gosh, this is actually really fun. There's very few things in life that you learn where you can actually use it and create something that's your own from scratch, and I think that's really special. And so if you do choose to learn to code or not, just remember to have fun with the things that you're learning, because if not, why are you learning them anyway? And so that's it. If you do want to learn to code, there's you can go to that URL where there's some tools, or come talk to me after. But yeah, thanks for listening.
Does anybody have any questions? Jerry.
You might as well just leave the mic with me. So, I actually have a degree in computer science, and I don't have anything on Product Hunt. And I saw that you have I think two products on Product Hunt?
4, yeah.
4.
Uh-huh.
So I really like your talk about how you focus on actually launching something, because from the degree perspective, you learn a lot of theory, you get a job, I've worked at companies, I've built stuff for other people, but I still don't have something I can point people to. So my question is, how did you get your product to be number 1? Did you do any marketing about it?
No, I at the time didn't. I think I got lucky for a couple of reasons. I was launching a lot of products around the same time. I was pretty active on Twitter, and so I didn't do any special thing with marketing, but I think it really was just a time period where I was getting my stuff out there. That was the only one that went to number 1. But I think people actually, for that one in particular, really just resonated with the idea of being able to input their life into the site and see how much time they're wasting. And so that got shared a lot, and I think that's the reason that one in particular went to number 1.
And did you do any research around what people might look at, or you just built what you wanted to build?
So at the time, as you can see, all 4 of the things that I launched are what I would call projects, not necessarily products that I would go and monetize or grow out for years and years and years. I think in general, one thing I would say is now that I've launched a bunch on Product Hunt and have a small following there, I get asked all the time how did you launch on Product Hunt, any tips, whatever. I would say one thing that's kind of taking a step back is that the Product Hunt launch, I think a lot of people invest in almost too much, where they think it's do or die. If my product works on Product Hunt, it's successful, or if it doesn't, it's not successful. But realistically, if you're going to create not a project, but a product, it needs to be able to sustain well past an actual Product Hunt launch. And so I wouldn't spend, a lot of people spend days or weeks in prep for this Product Hunt launch, and I instead would focus on your product during that time period. I know that's kind of a pseudo answer, but that's what I would say.
No, that makes sense. That saves me probably weeks of what's the best thing to do?
Yeah.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Is there someone else?
Thank you. Hello, yeah, thank you for the talk. It obviously resonates with me because I've been coding for about 10 years and it has changed a lot. And like you said, there's literally no better time to start. It's easier, more accessible and friendly than it's ever been. My question actually is also kind of... Oh, yeah. As much as I like my day-to-day, I do like just making fun little projects, just having fun with it, little side gigs. And did you try anything else other than Product Hunt to put it out there and showcase it or share it?
Yeah, I mean, depending on what you create, like I would definitely encourage you to spend some time on Indie Hackers, post your stuff on like Show on Hacker News. I would say for making stuff in particular, Twitter is the best social channel to get involved in. That's where all the makers hang out. That's where I've gained a lot of like both digital and in-person connections in that space. And then if you create like a niche product, go post like on that particular subreddit, or go find out where those people are hanging out and post it there. But in general, like I think just creating things for the like sake of creating things is great, and you should do it for that reason, not necessarily to like get a bunch of people using it. It's great if they do, but like I equally think it's great to just create things and put it out there.
Cool, thank you.
Someone else?
Sure. Thank you so much for this talk, because I got caught up in the different options for languages, but then secondly, so many options on learning platforms, and not really knowing before I go and make an investment. Do you have any recommendations or suggestions on what learning platform should I go to, or at least if it's a few to choose from?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, as long as a course has like over 4.5 stars and like over a couple dozen ratings, it will be good, like really good. The one I did was on Udemy. It was called the Web Developer Bootcamp by Colt Steele. Would definitely recommend it. Like that's the one I did. I got through it, and that taught me how to code. But I try to stray away from only recommending that, because I do truly believe there's like dozens of other really good courses out there, and it just is a matter of just selecting one that's on sale, that has decent ratings, and just like actually going through and doing it.
Anyone else?
Oh, perfect. So my name is Tal. I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you. I've also been building little tiny, fun projects on the side for 4 years now. I built the world's first website with 0 words, but I don't know how to code, and I spent a lot of time using visual builders like Elementor or Wix, putting elements together in a more visual format and linking it together, things like that. Maybe a tiny bit of, HTML and CSS to style it. But my question is, from your perspective, there's a lot of visual builders out there which you can go from an idea in your head to build a functional product, maybe without the dynamic elements of JavaScript. But what are your views on that? And do you think it's that much more important to actually, spend a bunch of time learning how to code on top of that? Or do you think it's good enough to be able to take an idea into a real tangible website that works, that maybe doesn't use the dynamic elements that JavaScript or some of these plugins might add?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and the no-code movement is a movement in that it's really taking off, and I think it's really exciting. But the reason I think no-code is exciting is because it basically empowers people who want to be like business owners, or who want to do stuff outside of development, who really don't want to create a company around software, but need a website or need software to actually be a portion of that, to do that quickly. So I think if your goal really is like, I just need to sell stuff online, like don't learn to build your own e-commerce store and just use Shopify, right? Like, I think there's a reason these companies exist. However, if there is an element of your business which really does function in a proprietary or meaningful way off of software, and that is something special about your business, right? It's not just like an enabler of your like wider business, it's something core to it, then I think it's really important to learn to code, because I see no code as basically like a Band-Aid on something that you will need to fix and patch up consistently, and will actually end up taking more of your time in the future. So it really depends on like, is your business related and like inherently linked to software in some way, or is it just like, I just need to build a business and it needs to have a small component so that people can find me. If it's the latter, just use a no-code solution. Like I've used WordPress, I use Ghost for my blog. Like these platforms are really great, but if you do want to, like everyone says like no one's gonna build the next Google with Zapier, like it's true, like no one will, because like Google is an inherently software related product. And so I think that's a good differentiator to ask yourself that question and decide whether you want to use no code or not.
Thanks for your answer.
Oh,